June 4th, 1942, 10:25 in the morning, 300 miles northwest of Midway Island, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo remained on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his flagship, observing his crew's work with frantic accuracy on the flight deck below. Dozens of aircraft crowded the deck, their engines being warmed, ordnance being loaded. Fuel hoses twisted across the wooden planking. Bombs and torpedoes rested in neat rows waiting to be mounted. Everything was ready. Everything was flawless. Within minutes, his strike force would launch against the American carriers his scout plane had finally sighted. 4 Japanese carriers against perhaps 3 American ones. The cold mathematics of carrier warfare favored him absolutely. Then someone on the bridge shouted and pointed upward. Nagumo looked up through the broken clouds. He saw them. Dark shapes, dozens of them, angling downward through the sky in steep dives. American dive bombers. They appeared as if they had materialized from nothing. Already committed to their attack runs. Already too close to halt. For one frozen instant, Nagumo understood with perfect clarity what was about to occur. His carriers were caught with their aircraft still on deck, fuel lines still connected, bombs still lying exposed. The worst possible moment. The first bomb struck Akagi amidships at 10:26. The explosion was unexpectedly small, almost underwhelming. Then the secondary detonations began. The aircraft on the deck, fully fueled and armed, began exploding. The neat rows of bombs and torpedoes ignited in a cascading chain reaction. Within seconds, the entire length of Akagi's flight deck became a sea of fire. The blast wave hurled Nagumo against the bridge railing. When he pulled himself upright, his flagship was already dying. "Get below!" someone was shouting. "The bridge is going to collapse." Nagumo stood frozen, watching his ship burn. This was Akagi, the Red Castle, the flagship of the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled, and it was being destroyed before him by bombs that had taken perhaps 3 minutes to fall from the sky. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, seized his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. Akagi is finished." Nagumo looked at him. Kusaka's face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn. The bridge around them was filling with smoke. Through the windows, they could see the flight deck buckling from the heat, the steel plates warping upward like paper in a fire. "The other carriers?" Nagumo asked. Kusaka's face gave him the answer before the words arrived. "Kaga is burning. Soryu is burning. Both were hit at the same time as us. 3 carriers. 3 of his 4 fleet carriers, all struck within the span of perhaps 5 minutes. Nagumo felt something inside him fracture, some fundamental assumption about how the world functioned. This was not how carrier battles happened. You found the enemy. You struck first. You won. That was the doctrine. That was what they had done at Pearl Harbor, at Ceylon, everywhere. The side that struck first won, and Japan always struck first. Except today, the Americans had struck first. And they had not just struck. They had struck with perfect timing at the exact moment when his carriers were most vulnerable. When every aircraft was on deck being rearmed, when fuel and ordnance were exposed. It was as if the Americans had known, as if they had planned it. "Admiral, please." Kusaka was pulling him toward the ladder. The smoke was growing thicker. Somewhere below, ammunition was cooking off in staccato bursts. The bridge crew was already evacuating, scrambling down the ladders to the deck below. Nagumo took one final look at his bridge, at the map spread across the table showing the positions of his force, the planned attack routes, the confident arrows pointing toward the American carriers they were supposed to destroy. Then he followed Kusaka down into the smoke. On the flight deck, it was hell. The wooden planking was burning, the flames spreading outward, Despite the efforts of damage control parties, aircraft were exploding, their fuel tanks rupturing and sending rivers of burning aviation gasoline across the deck. Men were running, some toward the fires with hoses and foam, others away from explosions, others simply running because there was nowhere else to go. Bodies lay where the first bomb's blast had caught them. The sweet, terrible smell of burning flesh mixed with aviation fuel and cordite. Captain Tairo Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, stood amidships directing the firefighting efforts, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. When he saw Nagumo, he saluted stiffly, his hand trembling. "Admiral, you must leave the ship. We cannot save her." "Your crew?" Nagumo asked. "Evacuating the lower decks now, but the fire is spreading to the hangar deck. We have aircraft down there, fully fueled and armed." Aoki did not need to explain what that meant. When the fire reached the hangar deck, Akagi would tear herself apart from the inside. A destroyer, Nowaki, pulled alongside. The transfer was chaos. Nagumo and his staff had to climb down rope ladders while Akagi rolled in the swells, her list increasing as water poured through ruptured plates below the waterline. As Nagumo descended, he could see the other carriers of his force. Kaga, 2 miles to the south, was burning even worse than Akagi, her entire superstructure engulfed in flames. Soryu, farther out, was listing heavily, black smoke pouring from her flight deck. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by 10 miles, appeared untouched. On Nowaki's deck, Nagumo stood and watched his flagship burn. Around him, his staff officers stood in stunned silence. These were men who had planned and executed the Pearl Harbor attack, who had sunk the British carriers Hermes and Cornwall off Ceylon, who had driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean. They had believed themselves invincible. They had believed carrier warfare was a science they had mastered. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, was weeping openly. "How did they know?" he kept saying. "How did they know exactly when to strike?" No one answered him. No one had an answer. A signal officer approached Nagumo with a message flimsy. "From Hiryu, sir. Admiral Yamaguchi reports his carrier is undamaged and preparing to launch a strike against the American carriers." Nagumo read the message. Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, was doing exactly what doctrine required, counterattacking immediately while the enemy was presumably still recovering from their own strike. It was the correct decision. It was what Nagumo would have ordered if he had been capable of thinking clearly. "Acknowledge," Nagumo said. "Tell Yamaguchi he has full authority to conduct operations as he sees fit." It was an admission, though he did not speak it aloud. He was no longer in command. His flagship was burning. His staff was scattered. His communications were disrupted. Yamaguchi, junior in rank, but with an intact carrier and functioning staff, was now effectively in charge of the Japanese carrier force. What was left of it? The afternoon brought more reports, each one worse than the last. Yamaguchi's strike from Hiryu found the American carrier Yorktown and damaged her severely. For a brief moment, Nagumo felt hope rise. Perhaps they could still prevail. Perhaps one American carrier crippled would be enough to turn the tide. Then, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the signal arrived from Hiryu. Enemy dive bombers overhead. Nagumo stood on Nowaki's bridge and watched through binoculars as, 10 miles away, Hiryu vanished beneath a cloud of bomb splashes. When the water settled, she was burning. All 4 of his carriers, the entire Kido Butai, destroyed in a single day. In less than 7 hours, the naval aviation force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had ceased to exist. On Nowaki's bridge, Kusaka approached him quietly. "Admiral, we should consider what to recommend to Combined Fleet Headquarters." Nagumo looked at him. Kusaka's meaning was unmistakable. They needed to tell Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, what had occurred. They needed to recommend whether to continue the operation or withdraw. They needed to make decisions. But Nagumo found that he could not think. His thoughts kept returning to that moment on Akagi's bridge, watching the dive bombers appear through the clouds. If the scout plane had found the American carriers 1 hour earlier, if he had launched his strike 30 minutes sooner, if the Americans had attacked 30 minutes later, any of these changes might have produced a different outcome. But none of them had happened. The Americans had struck at the one perfect moment when his carriers were most exposed, and now they were gone. "Signal combined fleet," Nagumo said at last. "Report that all 4 carriers have been hit and are burning. Request instructions." 300 miles to the west, on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports from Nagumo's force at 11 in the morning. The messages were fragmentary and confused. Akagi hit by bombs, Kaga on fire, Soryu burning. Yamamoto read them without expression, his face a mask. Captain Kamijiro Oshima, Yamato's captain, watched his admiral carefully. Yamamoto was a small man, quiet and controlled, famous for his poker face. He had opposed war with America and had predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year but could guarantee nothing beyond that. Now, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, his prediction was coming true. "Confirmation?" Yamamoto asked softly. "Still waiting, Admiral. Communications are disrupted, but multiple reports indicate heavy damage to at least 3 carriers." Yamamoto nodded slowly. He walked to the chart table and studied the dispositions. His plan for Midway had been complex, perhaps excessively so. Multiple forces approached from different directions, the carriers in the lead, his battleships, including Yamato, 300 miles behind. The intention had been to draw out the American fleet and destroy it in a decisive engagement. But carrier battles, Yamamoto knew better than anyone, were decided in minutes. By the time his battleships could intervene, the carrier battle would already be finished. And if Nagumo's carriers were lost, Admiral. Another message flimsy was handed to Yamamoto. He read it, and for the first time his control slipped. The hand holding the message trembled slightly. All 4 carriers hit, all burning. Kaga and Soryu sinking. Akagi and Hiryu still afloat but fires out of control. Yamamoto walked slowly to the bridge windows and stared out at the empty ocean. Around Yamato steamed the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. 11 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Transports carrying 5,000 troops for the invasion of Midway. All of it useless without air cover. All of it exposed to American carrier aircraft. "The American carriers?" Yamamoto asked. "One reported damaged by Hiryu's strike. Possibly 2 others undamaged. So the Americans still had carriers, and Japan now had none." The mathematics of naval warfare were brutally simple. Carriers controlled the ocean. Without carriers, battleships became targets, beautiful, powerful, useless targets. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, approached carefully. "Admiral, we should consider our options. We still have overwhelming surface superiority if we can draw the American battleships into a night action." "The Americans will not come," Yamamoto said quietly. "They do not need to. They can stand off and strike us with aircraft. We cannot reach them, and we cannot defend ourselves." He turned from the window. "How long until we are within range of Midway-based aircraft?" Oshima checked the chart. "If we maintain course and speed, approximately 8 hours." The implications hung heavily in the air. If Yamamoto continued toward Midway, his fleet would come under attack from land-based bombers with no defense except anti-aircraft fire. His battleships might survive, But his cruisers and destroyers would be slaughtered. And for what? To bombard an island they could no longer invade without air superiority? "Signal all forces," Yamamoto said. "Prepare to withdraw to the northwest." Ugaki stiffened. "Admiral, the operation—" "The operation is over," Yamamoto said flatly. "We have lost 4 carriers. The Americans have lost at most 1. We cannot continue." "But Admiral Nagumo is still requesting—" "Admiral Nagumo," Yamamoto said, his voice now edged with steel, "no longer has a force to command. His carriers are burning. His aircraft are at the bottom of the ocean. What exactly do you expect him to do?" Ugaki had no answer. Yamamoto turned back to the window. Outside, the ocean was calm, beautiful, empty. Somewhere beyond the horizon, 4 carriers were dying. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The names were legendary. They had struck Pearl Harbor. They had dominated the Pacific. And now they were gone, destroyed in a single morning by an enemy that had been expected to be surprised, unprepared, and defeated. "I have miscalculated," Yamamoto said quietly, almost to himself. "I told them we could run wild for 6 months. It has been exactly 6 months." On Yamato's bridge, no one spoke. The junior officers kept their eyes fixed on their instruments, unwilling to witness their admiral's moment of realization. The senior officers stood in uncomfortable silence, fully aware that they were watching the moment Japan's offensive war in the Pacific ended. Yamamoto straightened his shoulders, his composure returning. "Signal to all forces. Break off the operation. Withdraw to the northwest. Maintain air search. Avoid contact with enemy carriers." He paused, then added, "And have someone obtain a damage report from Admiral Nagumo. I want to know if any of our carriers can be saved." The answer came back within the hour. Akagi, "Fires out of control. Abandoned ship ordered. Kaga, sinking. Most of the crew evacuated. Soryu, sunk. Hiryu, still afloat but burning. Fires spreading toward the magazines. None could be saved. All would be at the bottom by morning." Yamamoto read the reports methodically, his face showing nothing. Then he dismissed his staff and stood alone on the bridge, gazing out at the ocean. A junior officer passing through the bridge on an errand later reported that he heard the admiral speaking quietly to himself, though he could not make out the words. Some later said that Yamamoto had apologized to the emperor. Others said he had simply been calculating, his mathematical mind already working through the consequences of losing 4 carriers. Back on the destroyer Nawaki, Nagumo watched the sun sink on June 4th. Around him, the ocean was scattered with debris and survivors. Destroyers were hauling men from the water, hundreds of them, some burned, some wounded, some simply exhausted from swimming. Akagi was still afloat, still burning. Her flight deck had collapsed. Her superstructure was a twisted wreck. Captain Aoki had wanted to go down with his ship. He had begged to be allowed to remain aboard. Nagumo had ordered him off. There had been enough death that day without adding ritual suicide to it. As darkness settled, the order came from Yamamoto. Scuttle Akagi. She was too damaged to save, too dangerous to leave afloat where American submarines might find her. 4 destroyers moved in and fired torpedoes into her hull. Akagi, the Red Castle, flagship of the Kido Butai, slipped beneath the waves at 5 in the morning on June 5th. Nagumo watched from Nawaki's deck as she went down. He did not speak. His staff officers stood around him in silence, their faces gray with exhaustion and shock. Commander Minoru Genda, the air operations officer who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, finally spoke. "Admiral, it wasn't your fault. The Americans knew we were coming. They had broken our codes. They had positioned their carriers perfectly." "It doesn't matter," Nagumo said quietly. "We lost. That is all that matters." Genda fell silent. Around them, The ocean was empty except for wreckage. 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, more than 2,000 men. All gone. The Kido Butai, the force that was supposed to be invincible, had been destroyed in a single day. On Hiryu, the last carrier still afloat, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the burning bridge and refused to leave. His carrier was dying, her fires out of control, her crew evacuating. "Admiral, please," his staff begged. "The ship is lost. You must transfer to a destroyer." Yamaguchi shook his head. "I commanded this ship. I will remain with her." Captain Tomeo Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, stepped forward. "Then I will stay as well." The staff officers pleaded. The ship was going to explode at any moment. The fires were reaching the magazines. There was no purpose in dying there. But Yamaguchi and Kaku were unmoved. They sent the staff away, ordered the remaining crew to evacuate, and stood alone on Hiryu's bridge. As the fires closed in, a destroyer came alongside for the final evacuation. The last men to leave Hiryu later reported seeing Yamaguchi and Kaku standing together on the bridge, silhouetted against the flames. Some said they were singing. Others said they were simply standing at attention, facing toward Tokyo, toward the emperor. At 2 o'clock in the morning on June 5th, Hiryu's magazines exploded. The carrier broke in half and sank within minutes. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with her. When the news reached Yamato, Yamamoto received it in silence. He then retired to his cabin and did not emerge for 12 hours. His staff, concerned, finally sent the fleet doctor to check on him. The doctor reported that the admiral was alive and well, sitting at his desk, staring at a photograph of the 4 carriers as they had appeared at Pearl Harbor, their decks crowded with aircraft, their flags flying, invincible. The withdrawal was chaos. Yamamoto's fleet scattered, different forces retreating on different courses, maintaining radio silence to avoid American submarines. The troop transports intended to invade Midway turned back. The battleships meant to shell the island steamed away into the darkness. The entire elaborate plan, months in preparation, dissolved in a single night. On Nawaki, Nagumo sat in the captain's cabin writing his report for Combined Fleet Headquarters. His hand shook as he wrote. The words came slowly. How did one explain losing 4 carriers in a single day? How did one describe watching a flagship burn? How did one tell the high command that the Kido Butai, the force they had relied on to control the Pacific, no longer existed? Kusaka found him there at dawn on June 5th. "Admiral, you should rest." Nagumo looked up. His eyes were red, his face haggard. "I should have known," he said. "The scout reports were delayed. The Americans appeared at the moment we were most vulnerable. They knew. They knew where we were. They knew what we were doing. They knew when to strike. We could not have known they had broken our codes." "I should have assumed it," Kusaka replied. "I should have assumed the worst," Nagumo said. "Instead, I assumed we would surprise them, as we always had. I assumed we would strike first, as we always had. I assumed we would win, as we always had." He looked down at his half-written report. "Now 4 carriers are gone, and more than 2,000 men are dead, and it is my fault." Kusaka had no answer. It was Nagumo's fault in the sense that he had commanded the force, but it was also Yamamoto's fault for planning an operation that dispersed Japan's strength too widely. It was the Navy Ministry's fault for believing their codes were secure, and it was the fault of every officer who had believed that Japan's early victories meant they were invincible. The blame could be spread widely enough to cover everyone, but in the end, Nagumo was right. He had commanded the carriers, and he had lost them. That was the only fact that mattered. The full scale of the catastrophe became clear in the days that followed. 4 fleet carriers lost, 322 aircraft destroyed, 2,200 men killed, including some of Japan's most experienced pilots and air crews. The entire elite of Japanese naval aviation, men who had trained for years, who had perfected their skills over China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean, gone in a single day. And for what? The Americans had lost Yorktown, sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days after the battle, one carrier. The exchange rate was 4-1 in America's favor, and America, with its immense industrial capacity, could replace Yorktown. Japan could not replace Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, not the ships, and certainly not the trained pilots and crews. Yamamoto understood this immediately. Within days of the battle, he was already planning a defensive strategy, something unthinkable before Midway. Japan would consolidate its holdings, strengthen its defenses, and try to make the cost of American advance too high to bear. The offensive was finished. The dream of dominating the Pacific was finished. Now it was only a matter of holding on, of making America pay for every island, of hoping that someday the Americans might tire and negotiate peace. But Yamamoto knew, even if he never said it aloud, that this was fantasy. America would not tire. America would not negotiate. America would build more carriers, train more pilots, and advance west with overwhelming power. Midway had not merely stopped Japan's offensive, it had sealed Japan's fate. On June 10th, Nagumo's force limped back into Hashirajima anchorage. The carriers were gone. The destroyers and cruisers that returned were battered, low on fuel, their crews exhausted. Nagumo transferred from Milwaukee to a cruiser and prepared to face the Navy Ministry to explain how he had lost 4 carriers in a single day. He expected to be court-martialed. He expected to be relieved of command. He expected perhaps to be forced into suicide. Instead, the Navy Ministry, desperate to conceal the scale of the disaster from the public, gave him another command. They could not admit that their greatest admiral had failed so catastrophically. They could not admit that the Kido Butai had been destroyed. So they promoted him, assigned new responsibilities, and pretended that Midway had been only a minor setback. But Nagumo knew the truth. He had stood on Akagi's bridge and watched the dive bombers fall from the sky. He had seen his carriers burn. He had watched more than 2,000 men die. No amount of propaganda could change that. No amount of pretending could bring back Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Years later, after more defeats, after more disasters, after the war had become a grinding nightmare of island battles and kamikaze attacks, Nagumo would find himself on Saipan, commanding the island's defense against an American invasion. When the island fell, when there was no escape and no hope, he would finally do what he may have wanted to do since Midway. He would take his pistol and end his life. A final admission that he had failed, that he had lost the carriers, that he had lost the war. But on June 10th, 1942, standing on the deck of a cruiser at Hashirajima anchorage, watching the empty sea where his carriers should have been, Nagumo simply stood in silence. Around him, his staff officers waited for orders, for guidance, for some indication of what came next. Nagumo had no answers. He had commanded the greatest carrier force in the world, and he had lost it in a single day. What came next was defeat. What came next was retreat. What came next was the slow, grinding destruction of everything Japan had built in 6 months of victories. But he could not say that. So he said nothing. He stood on the deck and stared at the empty ocean and remembered the moment when the dive bombers appeared through the clouds. The moment when he understood that everything was about to change. The moment when Japan's war in the Pacific ended before it had truly begun. On Yamato, Yamamoto received the casualty reports and read them methodically. More than 2,000 men dead, hundreds more wounded, 4 carriers sunk, the Kido Butai destroyed. He filed the reports carefully, wrote his assessment for the Navy Ministry, and then sat alone in his cabin, staring at the photograph of the carriers at Pearl Harbor. Someone later asked him what he had felt in that moment, reading the casualty lists, understanding what Midway meant. Yamamoto simply shook his head. "I told them," he said quietly, "I told them we could run wild for 6 months. It has been 6 months." The mathematics were simple. The outcome was inevitable. Japan had gambled everything on a quick victory, on breaking America's will before America's industry could mobilize. And they had lost that gamble at Midway, lost it in a single morning when 4 carriers burned and sank and took Japan's offensive with them to the bottom of the Pacific. What the Japanese admirals said when American carriers destroyed their fleet at Midway was mostly silence, because there was nothing left to say. No words could change what had happened. No explanations could bring back the ships or the men. No amount of analysis could alter the fundamental fact that Japan had lost, catastrophically. They had stood on their bridges and watched their carriers burn. They had read the casualty reports and understood what they meant. They had known in that moment that the war was over. Even though it would continue for 3 more years, they had known that they had lost everything in a single day. Lost it to an enemy they had underestimated. Lost it because they had believed their own propaganda of invincibility. And so, they said nothing. They stood in silence and watched the ocean and understood that they had done this to themselves, to their men, to their nation, and that there was nothing left to do but continue fighting a losing battle, watching everything they had built slowly collapse until the end finally came. And they could at last stop pretending that Midway had been anything other than what it truly was: the day Japan lost the war.